Alright everyone, let us begin. Today we continue our discussion of the war between the United States and Iran. In the last class I gave you an overview of the strategic and military position of both sides, and I made a prediction that many people found shocking, maybe even absurd. I said that the United States will lose this war. Now when people hear that, they immediately object. They say, how can that be possible? America is far stronger. America has better weapons, better aircraft, better intelligence, more money, more allies, more satellites, more everything. And on the surface, that objection sounds reasonable. It sounds obvious. It sounds like common sense. But game theory teaches us something very important. It teaches us that common sense, especially in war, is very often wrong. The stronger side is not always stronger in the way that matters. The weaker side is not always weaker in the way that matters. And so today I want to give you the theoretical framework that allows us to understand why a stronger empire can lose to a weaker enemy. This is one of the most important ideas in the entire course. I call it the Law of Asymmetry. Write this down. The Law of Asymmetry. What does it mean? Very simply, it means this. Two opponents can enter a conflict with radically unequal material power, and yet the side with less material power can still possess the deeper structural advantage. The stronger side looks overwhelming at first, but hidden inside its strength are the seeds of weakness. The weaker side looks vulnerable at first, but hidden inside its vulnerability are the seeds of transformation. That is the key. So yes, America and Iran are not equals. They are not peers. America is vastly more powerful in conventional terms. It has more wealth, more reach, more organization, more advanced technology, more capacity for destruction. If you compare them on paper, the result seems obvious, and yet history tells us over and over and over again that the outcome of these situations is often the opposite of what people expect. Think about the Persian invasion of Greece. Think about the rise of Macedonia. Think about Rome in its early phases. Think about steppe peoples, tribes on the edges of empires, frontier societies, small nations, mountain peoples. Again and again, in human history, great imperial centers fall before enemies that appeared weaker, poorer, more primitive, less sophisticated. Why? That is what we are doing today. I want to go very slowly because if you understand this lecture, then you understand not just this war. You understand why empires rise, why they decay, and why their enemies sometimes become unstoppable. So let us start with the empire. What are the advantages of an empire? There are three major advantages, three big ones. There are others, but these are the most important. The first is mass. The second is organization. The third is what I will call depth. Let us go through them one at a time. Mass simply means scale, population, resources, territory. The empire has a huge number of people or access to a huge number of people. America has a large domestic population, but more importantly, it sits at the center of a much larger alliance system. It can draw not only on its own citizens, but on the economies, industries, logistical nodes, military bases, intelligence relationships, and client networks of a vast global order. When America fights, it does not fight alone. It fights with the shadow of an entire world system behind it. That is mass. Now the second is organization. By organization, I mean bureaucracy, hierarchy, institutions, scientific management, administrative capacity, command structure, technological coordination. The empire can process information at scale. It can mobilize supply chains. It can coordinate air power with satellite intelligence, signals interception, cyber capabilities, diplomatic pressure, sanctions, media management, financial warfare, covert action, all at once. It has ministries, agencies, contractor networks, war planners, intelligence services, databases, research labs, military academies, and industrial systems that smaller states simply cannot match. That is organization. The third is depth. Depth means the ability to absorb losses and continue fighting. A small state can lose a city and face disaster. A small movement can lose its leaders and be shattered. But an empire has buffers. It has reserves. It can lose a battle and come back. It can lose a commander and replace him. It can waste money, mismanage campaigns, make mistakes, and still continue. It can fail. And because it is so large, it does not immediately collapse. This is very important. Depth means that the empire can survive error. So if you look at mass, organization, and depth, the empire seems invincible. It seems like a machine too large to defeat. It seems like history should belong to it forever. And yet every empire falls, every single one, not some, all. And most of them do not even last that long in civilizational terms. Compared to the age of a culture, compared to the memory of a people, compared to the duration of a religion, empires are often surprisingly short-lived. They rise fast, become arrogant, decay internally, and then break. So clearly something is wrong with the simple story. If these advantages are so overwhelming, why do empires collapse? The answer is that over time their advantages turn into liabilities. This is the heart of the law of asymmetry. The same forces that make an empire powerful in the short term make it brittle in the long term. Let us begin with mass. What happens when you have too many people, too much wealth, too much scale? At first, scale looks like abundance. Later, it becomes competition. When a society grows large and complex, inequality tends to intensify. More people compete for prestige, jobs, capital, land, state access, educational pathways, influence, and protection. Wealth concentrates. Debt expands, dependency grows, more and more people feel alienated from the system. They become atomized, cynical, suspicious. They no longer experience the empire as a shared project. They experience it as a machine they must survive. This has huge consequences for war. A mass society often becomes materially powerful, but spiritually weak. The people become comfortable, distracted, fragmented, demoralized, or simply indifferent. They may still consume patriotic images, but they no longer want real sacrifice. They may cheer abstract war, but they do not want to bleed for it. They may support force in theory, but in practice they do not know what they are fighting for. So mass becomes weakness because it produces internal competition, inequality, and indifference. Now let us look at organization. Organization creates elites. It creates administrators, managers, planners, experts, financiers, bureaucrats, media professionals, institutional gatekeepers, military officers, legal classes, intelligence cadres, and political factions. At first, this is useful, but over time, these elites begin to serve themselves. They become insulated from reality. They become more concerned with position than truth. Their job is no longer to solve problems. Their job becomes to preserve rank, access, and influence. When that happens, the system stops rewarding excellence and starts rewarding loyalty, signaling, manipulation, and rent extraction. Everyone wants elite status. More and more people compete for a limited number of positions. This produces internal struggle at the top, faction fights, careerist intrigue, polarization, narrative warfare, institutional sabotage. You get what some historians call elite overproduction. Too many ambitious people chasing too little real authority. Then they turn the whole society into a battlefield for their competition. And so organization, which once made the empire effective, turns into sclerosis. It becomes rigidity, infighting, self-deception, and paralysis. Now let us turn to depth. Depth means the empire can survive mistakes. But what happens when people believe there are no consequences? They become careless, arrogant, complacent. They stop learning. They assume the system will always protect them. They assume that if plan A fails, there will always be a plan B. And if plan B fails, there will be another bailout, another escalation, another temporary fix, another way to push the costs onto somebody else. This creates hubris. Hubris is not just arrogance. It is blindness produced by power. It is the inability to see your own limits because you have been protected from them for too long. And hubris is fatal, so now put it all together. Mass leads to inequality and indifference. Organization leads to elite parasitism and factional conflict. Depth leads to hubris and incompetence. This is why an empire must eventually decline. Not because it is weak in an absolute sense, but because its own power corrodes the hewn foundations that power depends on. Now, however, an empire does not simply disappear. It usually needs pressure. It needs an opponent. It needs some external force that exposes its hidden weaknesses and makes the impossible to ignore. That is where the underdog comes in. What advantages can the underdog develop against an empire? Again, 3. The first is energy. The second is openness. The third is cohesion. Energy means motivation, will, urgency, readiness to sacrifice. The underdog knows it cannot drift. It cannot sleepwalk. It cannot outsource seriousness. If it fails, it pays the price immediately. That creates intensity. Openness means a capacity to learn. The weaker side cannot afford comforting illusions. It has to adapt. It has to notice its mistakes, debate them, correct them, and improvise under pressure. The empire says, we know. The underdog says, we must learn. Cohesion means unity of purpose. The underdog does not have to agree on everything. But if it comes to believe that survival itself is at stake, then internal divisions can become secondary to collective endurance. And if a weaker society develops energy, openness, and cohesion, then it becomes very difficult to defeat. This is the grand question in any asymmetric war, not who has more bombs, not who has more bombs, not who has more money, not who has better television anchors. The real question is, which side is becoming more alive through the struggle? That is the question. Now let us apply this to America and Iran. Let us start with America. What are America's 3 major strengths in this war? Again, we simplified for clarity. The first is technology. The second is propaganda. The third is money. Technology is obvious. Precision strike capability, advanced aircraft, surveillance architecture, long-range weapons, electronic systems, intelligence fusion, command and control integration. America can see, classify, and strike targets in ways that many states cannot. The second is propaganda, by which I mean information dominance, narrative control, agenda setting, Framing: America and the wider CIS. Term around it possess extraordinary influence over what is visible, what is emphasized, what is ignored, and how events are interpreted. This is not merely media in the narrow sense. It includes digital platforms, think tanks, expert networks, search architecture, elite discourse, and the broader symbolic environment in which legitimacy is manufactured. The third is money, financial depth, reserve currency privilege, sanctions power, credit creation, bribe, patronage, subsidized alignment. The empire can spend enormous sums to extend conflict, recruit proxies, buy cooperation, reward loyalty, or simply cover up inefficiency for much longer than weaker states can. Now again, these look like overwhelming strengths. But through the law of asymmetry, we must ask a different question. How do these strengths mutate into weaknesses? Let us begin with technology. The more advanced your tools, the more tempted you are to rely on them instead of your own adaptability. Technology can extend perception, but it can also narrow imagination. You begin to think that what you can detect is all that matters. You begin to assume that what can be targeted can be controlled. You start mistaking technical superiority for strategic wisdom. And that is a disaster, because war is not a video game. It is not simply a question of whether you can hit something. It is a question of whether your violence generates the political and social outcomes you want. The danger of overwhelming technology is that it encourages laziness of thought. It encourages the fantasy that every problem has a technical solution, that every failure can be corrected by more targeting, more throughput, more data, more precision, more force. But highly technical systems can become fragile in a different way. They can lose improvisational resilience. The soldiers become dependent. The planners beckle. Me overconfident, the institutions begin to underestimate low-tech persistence, decentralized adaptation, and the social dimension of war. So technology does not simply make you stronger. It can make you rigid. Now propaganda. Surely, people say, controlling the narrative is a great strength. Yes, in the short term. But what is the cost of narrative control? The cost is that dissent becomes dangerous. Honest criticism gets filtered out. Self-correction becomes more difficult because institutions begin protecting image rather than truth. The system starts rewarding those who reassure power, not those who challenge it. Bad assumptions remain unchallenged because too many people benefit from pretending things are going well. And then something terrible happens. The empire starts believing its own narrative. That is one of the most dangerous moments in politics. When propaganda stops being just a tool used on others and becomes a psychological environment inhabited by the elite themselves, then open debate narrows. Strategic criticism disappears. People become afraid to say this is not working. Policy becomes theater. Rhetoric replaces adaptation. Failure gets renamed progress. That is how information dominance turns into collective self-deception. Now money buys access. It buys time. It buys loyalty, or at least the appearance of loyalty. It buys proxies, subcontractors, consultants, militias, exile groups, opportunists, and all sorts of people who claim they are ready to help. But money also attracts liars. The more you pay, the more you invite performance rather than commitment. People tell you what you want to hear. They exaggerate their strength. They invent opportunities. They promise influence they do not have. They become dependent on the continuation of your sponsorship, which means they often have an incentive not to solve the problem, but to keep the problem alive. So if you build your strategy on money, you may discover that many of your partners are not fighters. They are hustlers. They do not want victory. They want invoices. This is a very old imperial problem. So what major strategic problems does America face once we look beneath the surface? 3 again. The first is lack of political will. The second is logistics and manufacturing strain. The third is casualty sensitivity. Lack of political will means the society is not truly mobilized by belief. It may tolerate war abstractly, but it is not spiritually invested in it. For many people, the war remains distant, confusing, or irrelevant. The average citizen does not experience it as a struggle for national survival. That matters enormously, because wars can be fought with machines, but they cannot be sustained without meaning. The second problem is logistics and manufacturing. It is one thing to launch strikes. It is another thing to sustain protracted attrition. Long wars are industrial tests. They burn through munitions, maintenance cycles, spare parts, transport capacity, and replacement infrastructure. A society optimized for financialization, outsourcing, and consumption may discover that large-scale industrial war reveals weaknesses it has spent decades hiding from itself. The third problem is casualty sensitivity. If the public does not deeply believe in the cause, then losses become politically toxic very fast. The empire then seeks to substitute firepower for exposure. It wants to kill without being touched. It wants coercion without sacrifice. It wants domination without risk. This preference then shapes the whole strategy. Now let us turn to Iran. Iran also has major weaknesses. Of course it does. But if it is to survive, it must make use of its own asymmetrical strengths. Three again. The first is faith, is something Iran. The third is national memory, or nationalism if you prefer. Faith means not simply religion in the abstract, but a culture of sacrifice, martyrdom, historical grievance, moral seriousness, and readiness to endure suffering for something larger than the self. Whether outsiders understand or respect it is not the issue. The issue is whether it generates will, and often it does. Terrain is obvious. Iran is not an easy place for invasion and occupation. It has depth of space, mountains' internal complexity, and geographic conditions that can turn military superiority into strategic exhaustion. The third is national memory. Iran is not merely a state apparatus. It is also a civilization-bearing society with deep historical consciousness. That matters. A people that sees itself as the carrier of a long civilizational arc can draw on forms of pride and endurance that are invisible in spreadsheets. Now again, every advantage contains risk. Faith can become fanaticism. Sacrifice can become waste. Courage can turn into blindness. Sacrifice can become waste. Courage can turn into blindness if leaders confuse willingness to die with willingness to think. Terrain can become prison if it leaves the population isolated, strangled or immobilized under siege conditions. National memory can fracture if the state fails to integrate minorities or if the broader civic identity is too weak to hold diversity cadegdity is too weak. So Iran's strengths are real, but they are not automatic. They must be translated into strategy. Otherwise, they become traps. And now we can see the likely logic of American strategy. If you are the stronger empire, but you lack political will, industrial patience, and tolerance for casualties, then what kind of war do you prefer? You prefer coercive war from a distance. You prefer pressure without occupation. You prefer punishment, decapitation, sabotage, air supremacy, infrastructure disruption, prox, where is something warfare, internal destabilization, and narrative control. In other words, you prefer to break the enemy from outside and inside at the same time while minimizing your own exposure. So what are the likely pillars of such a strategy? First, decapitation. You target leadership, command networks, communication nodes, organizational centers, state capacity, and elite continuity. The goal is not merely to kill individuals. The goal is to create disorientation, succession, panic, institutional distrust, and administrative breakdown. Second, aerial punishment and infrastructure degradation. You use air power not only against military targets, but against the systems that allow society to function. Transport, energy, communications, repair capability, morale centers, and symbolic sites. You make normal life impossible. You produce fatigue, fear, exhaustion, confusion, and helplessness. Third, proxy destabilization. You look for peripheral fractures, ethnic grievances, sectarian tensions, border insurgencies, exile groups, covert cells, black market channels, criminal intermediaries, information operations, and all the tools that transform internal diversity into political fragmentation. And on paper, this can look formidable. But according to the law of asymmetry, the deeper question is not whether this strategy can hurt Iran. Of course it can. The question is whether this strategy might unintentionally generate the very qualities that make the weaker side harder to defeat. Now, this is the part that people miss. If you decapitate a bloated elite structure, what might happen? You might remove stagnant layers and force rapid circulation of responsibility. You might clear space for harder, leaner, more adaptive leadership. You might accidentally intensify merit under pressure, a system that was previously clogged by caution, status competition, and internal rivalry may become more severe, more disciplined, and more decisive after shock. If you punish society from the air, what might happen? You might initially create terror and disruption, but you might also create solidarity. Groups that previously hated each other may begin to experience themselves as part of the same wound. Urban and rural, secular and religious, elite and ordinary, center and periphery, all can be pushed by external pressure into a more unified experience of danger. If you activate proxies and peripheral insurgencies, what might happen? You may expose diversity as vulnerability, but you may also awaken core identity. The pressure of fragmentation can reactivate civilizational memory in the center. People start asking, who are we? What are we defending? What survives if we lose? And that can be a powerful answer generator. So the paradox is this. The imperial strategy intended to break the enemy may instead transform the enemy. That is asymmetry. The empire attacks to produce collapse. The weaker society absorbs attack and begins producing energy, openness, and cohesion. Now let me be clear. This transformation is not automatic. It depends on whether the weaker side can learn. If it simply suffers without adaptation, it loses. Pain alone does not create strength. Pain interpreted collectively, strategically, and honestly can create strength. This is why the real test is social and psychological, not merely military. Will Iran become more energetic? Will it become more open to learning? Will it become more cohesive? That is the decisive variable. If yes, then time shifts in its favor. If not, then the empire's advantages may still prevail. Now let us talk about the likely Iranian response if it understands the situation. If the imperial strategy is a kind of siege and coercive degradation, then the rational answer is not symmetrical confront, ion. It is not to meet the empire where the empire is strongest. It is not to seek prestige battles that flatter the empire's technology. The rational answer is dispersed endurance, what we may broadly call guerrilla logic. Guerrilla logic is not merely a tactic. It is a philosophy of time. It says, I do not need to defeat you in one stroke. I need to remain present, adaptive, and painful to eliminate. I need to make your superiority expensive, inconclusive, and politically corrosive. I need to stretch the war until your own contradictions become more important than my weaknesses. This is crucial. The weaker side often wins not by conquering the stronger side, but by outlasting the stronger side's ability to justify the struggle to itself. So what does that look like? It looks like dispersal, concealment, redundancy, denial of clear targets, calibrated retaliation, survival under infrastructure stress, symbolic counterstrikes, low-cost harassment, regional pressure points, and strategic patience. Not necessarily dramatic victories, not necessarily glorious offensives, just enough resistance to deny closure. Just enough persistence to force repeated overreaction. Just enough persistence to force repeated overreaction. Just enough pain to turn the empire's political weaknesses inward. Hide, survive. Reappears, strike, endure. This can go on for years if the weaker side has the will. And that is exactly what a casualty-sensitive, politically ambivalent empire fears most. Not necessarily defeat on the battlefield in a cinematic sense, but endless friction, endless cost, endless ambiguity. Endless inability to convert destruction into control. Now here we arrive at a very important threshold question. Would the empire escalate to ground invasion? Because if it does, the nature of the war changes dramatically. Aerial punishment is one thing. Occupation is another universe altogether. A ground invasion, honest exposure to terrain, logistics, ambush, supply vulnerability, morale erosion, urban complexity, mountain warfare, and the enormous burden of holding space politically, not just entering it militarily. And this is where many great powers have overestimated themselves. It is easy to enter, harder to remain, much harder to pacify. So if the empire is drawn into ground commitment without deep public conviction, without adequate industrial endurance, and without a coherent political end state, then it may discover that the war has become a mechanism for draining itself. And then people ask the biggest question of all, if this path is so dangerous, why does the empire go down it? Why does the sophisticated system make moves that seem strategically irrational? Now, this is where game theory becomes more subtle. Often students think that if an action looks irrational under one payoff model, then the actor must be stupid. Not necessarily. It may simply mean you have misunderstood the game they believe they are playing. Very important. Game theory is not just about moves. It is about payoffs. It is about preferences. It is about preferences. It is about what each actor thinks counts as victory. If you think the players care mainly about territory, money, and conventional strategic gain, then certain wars seem absurd. But if some of the actors are motivated by ideological, symbolic, civilizational, theological, or apocalyptic frameworks, then the payoff matrix changes. Then what looked irrational may become rational relative to their internal worldview. I am not saying that is the whole story. I am saying that if you want to understand power, you must stop assuming everyone values what you value. Some actors may be willing to accept enormous material costs for symbolic or metaphysical rewards. Some may view war as theater for destiny. Some may believe destruction itself can serve revelation, purification, or historical mission. Whether you agree is irrelevant. If they believe it, it affects the game. And that brings us to a deeper level of this course. Why do people fight? What is the real currency of power? Most people think the answer is money. No. Money matters, but money is not ultimate. Power at the deepest level is tied to human consciousness, attention, belief, meaning, perception, legitimacy, the symbolic frameworks through which people interpret sacrifice, obedience, danger, hope, enemies, and history. Whoever shapes consciousness shapes what people are willing to endure, what they are willing to justify, and what kind of reality they think they inhabit. That is why war is never merely about bombs and borders. It is also about controlling narratives of meaning. It is about defining who is civilized, who is monstrous, who is chosen, who who is obsolete, who is chosen, who is obsolete, who is grieving, who is legitimate, who is exerpho, who is grieving, who is legitimate, who is legitimate, who is sacred, who can be killed without moral cost, and who can command the future. This is why propaganda matters so much. This is why memory matters so much. This is why martyrdom, identity, civilization, victimhood, liberation, destiny, apocalypse, and justice all matter so much. These are not side decorations. They are part of the battlefield. And if a war begins to transform consciousness, then it is no longer only a regional conflict. It becomes a struggle over how human beings interpret reality itself. Now, again, be careful. That does not mean mystical nonsense. It means that political order always rests on shared mental worlds. If those shared mental worlds fracture, regimes lose coherence. If those mental worlds consolidate, people endure astonishing levels of suffering. So the empire is fighting materially, yes, but it is also fighting to maintain a certain architecture of legitimacy and perception. The buck underdog is fighting materially, yes, but it is also fighting to awaken a counter-consciousness, a counter-history, a counter-source of legitimacy. That is why asymmetric wars are so dangerous. They do not stay limited. They spill from military space into moral space, symbolic space, and civilizational space. Now let me conclude by bringing all of this into one frame. The law of asymmetry says that visible superiority can conceal invisible weakness, and visible weakness can generate invisible strength. The empire begins with mass organization in depth, but over time these become inequality, factionalism, and hubris. The underdog begins with disadvantage, but under pressure it can produce energy, openness, and cohesion. In the case of America, its strengths are technology, propaganda, and money. But these can become dependency, self-deception, and corruption by patronage. Its weaknesses are lack of political will, strain in prolonged industrial war, and deep sensitivity to casualties in open-ended entanglement. In the case of Iran, its potential strengths are faith, terrain, and civilizational memory. But these matter only if they are converted into adaptive strategy rather than wasted in rigidity or blindness. The imperial strategy is likely to rely on decapitation, aerial punishment, and internal fragmentation. But if those methods generate social hardening rather than collapse, then they may end up making Iran more energetic, more open to adaptation, and more cohesive. And if that happens, then time becomes the ally of the weaker side. That is the game. Not who appears strongest today, but who is being transformed by conflict into a more viable historical actor. So as you follow events, do not be hypnotized by firepower alone. Do not confuse spectacle with control. Do not assume destruction equals victory. Ask the deeper questions. Is the straight on your side becoming more arrogant or more honest? Is the weaker side becoming more broken or more unified? Is violence dissolving identity or consolidating it? Are institutions learning or merely escalating? Who can still change? Because in asymmetric conflict, the side that can still learn may defeat the side that can only intensify. All right, that is enough for today. Next time we will continue by looking more closely at the strategic forms of siege warfare, guerrilla adaptation, and the politics of legitimacy in long wars. And we will also discuss a deeper question that follows from today's lecture: how symbolic power, religious narrative, and collective attention reshape what rationality even means inside conflict. Any questions? All right, I will see you next week.